This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 3. The Temple of the Sun. There was nothing for it now other than to fight, nor did I have any advantage as I sprang, sword in hand, into the corridor before the two therns, for my untimely sneeze had warned them of my presence and they were ready for me. There were no words, for they would have been a waste of breath. The very presence of the two proclaimed their treachery. That they were following to fall upon me unawares was all too plain, and they, of course, must have known that I understood their plan. In an instant I was engaged with both, and though I loathe the very name of Thurn, I must in all fairness admit that they are mighty swordsmen, and these two were no exception, unless it were that they were even more skilled and fearless than the average among their race. While it lasted, it was indeed as joyous a conflict as I ever had experienced. Twice at least I saved my breast from the mortal thrust of piercing steel only by the wondrous agility with which my earthly muscles endow me under the conditions of lesser gravity and air pressure upon Mars. Yet even so I came near to tasting death that day, in the gloomy corridor beneath Mars's southern pole. For Lakor played a trick upon me that in all my experience of fighting upon two planets I never before had witnessed the like of. The other Thurn was engaging me at the time, and I was forcing him back, touching him here and there with my point until he was bleeding from a dozen wounds, yet not being able to penetrate his marvelous guard to reach a vulnerable spot for the brief instant that would have been sufficient to send him to his ancestors. It was then that Lakor quickly unslung a belt from his harness, and as I stepped back to parry a wicked thrust, he lashed one end of it about my left ankle so that it wound there for an instant, while he jerked suddenly upon the other end, throwing me heavily upon my back. Then, like leaping panthers, they were upon me, but they had reckoned without Woola, and before ever a blade touched me, a roaring embodiment of 1,000 demons hurtled above my prostrate form, and my loyal Martian Kullet was upon them. Imagine, if you can, a huge grizzly with 10 legs armed with mighty talons, and an enormous frog-like mouth splitting his head from ear to ear, exposing 3 rows of long white tusks. Then endow this creature of your imagination with the agility and ferocity of a half-starved Bengal tiger and the strength of a span of bulls, and you will have some faint conception of Woola in action. Before I could call him off, he had crushed Lakor into a jelly with a single blow of one mighty paw, and had literally torn the other Thurn to ribbons. Yet when I spoke to him sharply, he cowed sheepishly as though he had done a thing to deserve censure and chastisement. Never had I had the heart to punish Woola during the long years that had passed since that first day upon Mars, when the green jet of the Tharks had placed him on guard over me, and I had won his love and loyalty from the cruel and loveless masters of his former life. Yet I believe he would have submitted to any cruelty that I might have inflicted upon him, so wondrous was his affection for me. The diadem in the center of the circlet of gold upon the brow of Lakor proclaimed him a holy Thurn, while his companion, not thus adorned, was a lesser Thurn, though from his harness I gleaned that he had reached the 9th cycle, which is but one below that of the holy Therns. As I stood for a moment looking at the gruesome havoc Woola had wrought, there recurred to me the memory of that other occasion upon which I had masqueraded in the wig, diadem, and harness of Sator Throg, the holy Thurn whom Thuvia of Parth had slain, and now it occurred to me that it might prove of worth to utilize Lakor's trappings for the same purpose. A moment later I had torn his yellow wig from his bald pate, and transferred it and the circlet, as well as all his harness, to my own person. Woola did not approve of the metamorphosis. He sniffed at me and growled ominously. But when I spoke to him and patted his huge head, he at length became reconciled to the change, and at my command trotted off along the corridor in the direction we had been going when our progress had been interrupted by the Therns. We moved cautiously now, warned by the fragment of conversation I had overheard. I kept abreast of Woola that we might have the benefit of all our eyes from what might appear suddenly ahead to menace us, and well it was that we were forewarned. At the bottom of a flight of narrow stairs the corridor turned sharply back upon itself, immediately making another turn in the original direction, so that at that point it formed a perfect letter S, the top leg of which debouched suddenly into a large chamber, illy lighted, and the floor of which was completely covered by venomous snakes and loathsome reptiles. To have attempted to cross that floor would have been to court instant death, and for a moment I was almost completely discouraged. Then it occurred to me that Thurid and Matai Shang, with their party, must have crossed it, and so there was a way. Had it not been for the fortunate accident by which I overheard even so small a portion of the therns' conversation, we should have blundered at least a step or two into that wriggling mass of destruction, and a single step would have been all sufficient to have sealed our doom. These were the only reptiles I had ever seen upon Barsoom, but I knew them from their similarity to the fossilized remains of supposedly extinct species I had seen in the museums of Helium, that they comprised many of the known prehistoric reptilian genera as well as others undiscovered. A more hideous aggregation of monsters had never before assailed my vision. It would be futile to attempt to describe them to Earthmen, since substance is the only thing which they possess in common with any creature of the past or present with which you are familiar. Even their venom is of an unearthly virulence that by comparison would make the cobra de capello seem quite as harmless as an angleworm. As they spied me there was a concerted rush by these nearest the entrance where we stood, but a line of radium bulbs inset along the threshold of their chamber brought them to a sudden halt. Evidently they dared not cross that line of light. I had been quite sure that they would not venture beyond the room in which I had discovered them, though I had not guessed at what deterred them. The simple fact that we had found no reptiles in the corridor through which we had just come was sufficient assurance that they did not venture there. I drew Woola out of harm's way, and then began a careful survey of as much of the chamber of reptiles as I could see from where I stood. As my eyes became accustomed to the dim light of its interior, I gradually made out a low gallery at the far end of the apartment from which opened several exits. Coming as close to the threshold as I dared, I followed this gallery with my eyes, discovering that it circled the room as far as I could see. Then I glanced above me, along the upper edge of the entrance to which we had come, and there, to my delight, I saw an end of the gallery not a foot above my head. In an instant I had leaped to it, and called Woola after me. Here there were no reptiles. The way was clear to the opposite side of the hideous chamber, and a moment later Woola and I dropped down to safety in the corridor beyond. Not 10 minutes later we came into a vast circular apartment of white marble, the walls of which were inlaid with gold in the strange hieroglyphics of the firstborn. From the high dome of this mighty apartment a huge circular column extended to the floor, and as I watched I saw that it slowly revolved. I had reached the base of the Temple of the Sun. Somewhere above me lay Dejah Thoris, and with her were Phaidor, daughter of Matai Shang, and Thuvia of Parth. But how to reach them, now that I had found the only vulnerable spot in their mighty prison, was still a baffling riddle. Slowly I circled the great shaft, looking for a means of ingress. Part way around I found a tiny radium flash torch, and as I examined it in mild curiosity as to its presence there in this almost inaccessible and unknown spot, I came suddenly upon the insignia of the house of Thurid, jewel inset in its metal case. I'm upon the right trail, I thought, as I slipped the bulb into the pocket pouch which hung from my harness. Then I continued my search for the entrance, which I knew must be somewhere about. Nor had I long to search, for almost immediately thereafter I came upon a small door so cunningly inlaid in the shaft's base that it might have passed unnoticed by a less keen or careful observer. There was the door that would lead me within the prison, but where was the means to open it? No button or lock were visible. Again and again I went carefully over every square inch of its surface, but the most that I could find was a tiny pinhole a little above to the right of the door's center, a pinhole that seemed only an accident of manufacture or an imperfection of material. Into this minute aperture I attempted to peer, but whether it was but a fraction of an inch deep or passed completely through the door I could not tell. At least no light showed beyond it. I put my ear to it next and listened, but again my efforts brought negligible results. During these experiments Woola had been standing at my side gazing intently at the door, and as my glance fell upon him it occurred to me to test the correctness of my hypothesis, that this porthole had been the means of ingress to the temple used by Thurid, the Black Dator, and Matai Shang, father of therns. Turning away abruptly, I called to him to follow me. For a moment he hesitated, then leaped after me, whining and tugging at my harness to draw me back. I walked on, however, some distance from the door before I let him have his way, that I might see precisely what he would do. Then I permitted him to lead me wherever he would. Straight back to that baffling portal he dragged me, again taking up his position facing the blank stone, gazing straight at its shining surface. For an hour I worked to solve the mystery of the combination that would open the way before me. Carefully I recalled every circumstance of my pursuit of Thurid, and my conclusion was identical with my original belief, that Thurid had come this way without other assistance than his own knowledge and passed through the door that barred my progress, unaided from within. But how had he accomplished it? I recalled the incident of the Chamber of Mystery in the Golden Cliffs that time I had freed Thuvia of Parth from the dungeon of the Therns, and she had taken a slender, needle-like key from the keyring of her dead jailer to open the door leading back into the Chamber of Mystery, where Tars Tarkas fought for his life with the great Bants. Such a tiny keyhole as now defied me had opened the way to the intricate lock in that other door. Hastily I dumped the contents of my pocket-pouch upon the ground before me. Could I but find a slender bit of steel, I might yet fashion a key that would give me ingress to the temple prison. As I examined the heterogeneous collection of odds and ends that is always to be found in the pocket-pouch of a Martian warrior, my hand fell upon the emblazoned radium flash-torch of the Black Dator. As I was about to lay the thing aside as of no value in my present predicament, my eyes chanced upon a few strange characters roughly and freshly scratched upon the soft gold of the case. Casual curiosity prompted me to decipher them, but what I read carried no immediate meaning to my mind. There were 3 sets of characters, one below another: 3-50T, 1-1X, 9-25T. For only an instant my curiosity was piqued, and then I replaced the torch in my pocket-pouch. But my fingers had not unclasped from it when there rushed to my memory the recollection of the conversation between Lakor and his companion when the Lesser Thern had quoted the words of Thurid and scoffed at them. And what think you of the ridiculous matter of the light? Let the light shine with the intensity of 3 radium units for 50 tals. Aha! There was the first line of characters upon the torch's metal case, 3-50T. And for 1x, let it shine with the intensity of 1 radium unit. There was the second line. And then for 25 tals with 9 units. The formula was complete, but what did it mean? I thought I knew, and seizing a powerful magnifying glass from the litter of my pocket-pouch, I applied myself to a careful examination of the marble immediately about the pinhole in the door. I could have cried aloud in exultation when my scrutiny disclosed the almost invisible incrustation of particles of carbonized electrons which are thrown off by these Martian torches. It was evident that for countless ages radium torches had been applied to this pinhole, and for what purpose there could be but a single answer. The mechanism of the lock was actuated by light rays, and I, John Carter, Prince of Helium, held the combination in my hand, scratched by the hand of my enemy upon his own torch case. In a cylindrical bracelet of gold about my wrist was my Barsoomian chronometer, a delicate instrument that records the tals and x's and zodes of Martian time, presenting them to view beneath a strong crystal much after the manner of an earthly odometer. Timing my operations carefully, I held the torch to the small aperture in the door, regulating the intensity of the light by means of the thumb lever upon the side of the case. For 50 tals I let 3 units of light shine full in the pinhole, then 1 unit for 1x, and for 25 tals 9 units. Those last 25 tals were the longest 25 seconds of my life. Would the lock click at the end of those seemingly interminable intervals of time? 23, 24, 25. I shut off the light with a snap. For 7 tals I waited. There had been no appreciable effect upon the lock's mechanism. Could it be that my theory was entirely wrong? Hold! Had the nervous strain resulted in a hallucination? Or did the door really move? Slowly the solid stone sank noiselessly back into the wall. There was no hallucination here. Back and back it slid for 10 feet until it had disclosed at its right a narrow doorway leading into a dark and narrow corridor that paralleled the outer wall. Scarcely was the entrance uncovered than Woola and I leaped through. Then the door slipped quietly back into place. Down the corridor at some distance I saw the faint reflection of a light, and toward this we made our way. At the point where the light shone was a sharp turn, and a little distance beyond this a brilliantly lighted chamber. Here we discovered a spiral stairway leading up from the center of the circular room. Immediately I knew that we had reached the center of the base of the Temple of the Sun. The spiral runway led upward past the inner walls of the prison cells. Somewhere above me was Dejah Thoris, unless Thurid and Matai Shang had already succeeded in stealing her. We had scarcely started up the runway when Woola suddenly displayed the wildest excitement. He leaped back and forth, snapping at my legs and harness, until I thought that he was mad, and finally when I pushed him from me and started once more to ascend, he grasped my sword arm between his jaws and dragged me back. No amount of scolding or cuffing would suffice to make him release me, and I was entirely at the mercy of his brute strength unless I cared to use my dagger upon him with my left hand. But, mad or no, I had not the heart to run the sharp blade into that faithful body. Down into the chamber he dragged me, and across it to the side opposite that at which we had entered. Here was another doorway leading into a corridor which ran directly down a steep incline. Without a moment's hesitation, Woola jerked me along this rocky passage. Presently he stopped and released me, standing between me and the way we had come, looking up into my face as though to ask if I would now follow him voluntarily, or if he must still resort to force. Looking ruefully at the marks of his great teeth upon my bare arm, I decided to do as he seemed to wish me to do. After all, his strange instinct might be more dependable than my faulty human judgment. And well it was that I had been forced to follow him. But a short distance from the circular chamber we came suddenly into a brilliantly lighted labyrinth of crystal glass partitioned passages. At first I thought it was one vast unbroken chamber, so clear and transparent were the walls of the winding corridors, but after I had nearly brained myself a couple of times by attempting to pass through solid vitreous walls, I went more carefully. We had proceeded but a few yards along the corridor that had given us entrance to this strange maze when Woola gave mouth to a most frightful roar, at the same time dashing against the clear partition at our left. The resounding echoes of that fearsome cry were still reverberating through the subterranean chambers when I saw the thing that had startled it from the faithful beast. Far in the distance, dimly through the many thicknesses of the intervening crystal, as in a haze that made them seem unreal and ghostly, I discerned the figures of 8 people, 3 females and 5 men. At the same instant, evidently startled by Woola's fierce cry, they halted and looked about. Then of a sudden, one of them, a woman, held her arms out toward me, and even at that great distance I could see that her lips moved. It was Dejah Thoris, my ever beautiful and ever youthful princess of Helium. With her were Thuvia of Parth, Phaidor, daughter of Matai Shang, and Thurid, and the father of therns, and the 3 lesser therns that had accompanied them. Thurid shook his fist at me, and then 2 of the therns grasped Dejah Thoris and Thuvia roughly by their arms and hurried them on. A moment later they had disappeared into a stone corridor beyond the labyrinth of glass. They say that love is blind, but so great a love as that of Dejah Thoris that knew me even beneath the thern disguise I wore and across the misty vista of that crystal maze must indeed be far from blind. End of Chapter 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 4. The Secret Tower. I have no stomach to narrate the monotonous events of the tedious days that Woola and I spent ferreting our way across the labyrinth of glass, through the dark and devious ways beyond that led beneath the valley door and golden cliffs, to emerge at last upon the flank of the Orts Mountains just above the Valley of Lost Souls, that pitiful purgatory peopled by the poor unfortunates who dare not continue their abandoned pilgrimage to Dor, or return to the various lands of the outer world from whence they came. Here the trail of Dejah Thoris's abductors led along the mountain's base, across steep and rugged ravines, by the side of appalling precipice, and sometimes out into the valley, where we found fighting aplenty with the members of the various tribes that make up the population of this vale of hopelessness. but through it all we came at last to where the way led up a narrow gorge that grew steeper and more impracticable at every step, until before us loomed a mighty fortress buried beneath the side of an overhanging cliff. Here was the secret hiding place of Matai Shang, father of the Therns. Here, surrounded by a handful of the faithful, the Hecador of the ancient faith, who had once been served by millions of vassals and dependents, dispensed the spiritual words among the half-dozen nations of Barsoom that still clung tenuously to their false and discredited religion. Darkness was just falling as we came in sight of the seemingly impregnable walls of this mountain stronghold, and lest we be seen, I drew back with Woola behind a jetting granite promontory into a clump of the hardy purple scrub that thrives upon the barren sides of orts. Here we lay until the quick transition from daylight to darkness had passed. Then I crept out to approach the fortress walls in search of a way within. Either through carelessness or overconfidence in the supposed inaccessibility of their hiding place, the triple-barred gate stood ajar. Beyond were a handful of guards, laughing and talking over one of their incomprehensible Barsoomian games. I saw that none of the guardsmen had been of the party that accompanied Thurid and Matai Shang, and so, relying entirely upon my disguise, I walked boldly through the gateway up to the Thern guard. The men stopped their game and looked up at me, but there was no sign of suspicion. Similarly, they looked at Woola, growling at my heel. "Kaor," I said in true Martian greeting, and the warriors arose and saluted me. "I have but just found my way hither from the Golden Cliffs," I continued, "and seek audience with the Hecador, Matai Shang, father of Therns. Where may he be found?" "Follow me," said one of the guard, and turning, led me across the outer courtyard toward a second buttressed wall. Why the apparent ease with which I seemingly deceived them did not arouse my suspicions I know not, unless it was that my mind was still so full of that fleeting glimpse of my beloved princess that there was room in it for naught else. Be that as it may, the fact is that I marched buoyantly behind my guide straight into the jaws of death. Afterward I learned that the Thern spies had been aware of my coming for hours before I reached the hidden fortress. The gate had been purposely left ajar to tempt me on. The guards had been schooled well in their part of conspiracy, and I, more like a schoolboy than a seasoned warrior, ran headlong into the trap. At the far side of the outer court a narrow door let into the angle made by one of the buttresses with the wall. Here my guide produced a key and opened the way within. Then, stepping back, he motioned me to enter. "Matai Shang is in the temple court beyond," he said, and as Woola and I passed through, the fellow closed the door quickly upon us. The nasty laugh that came to my ears through the heavy planking of the door after the lock click was my first intimation that all was not as it should be. I found myself in a small circular chamber within the buttress. Before me a door opened, presumably upon the inner court beyond. For a moment I hesitated, all my suspicions now suddenly, though tardily, aroused. Then, with a shrug of my shoulders, I opened the door and stepped out into the glare of torches that lighted the inner court. Directly opposite me a massive tower rose to a height of 300 feet. It was of the strangely beautiful modern Barsoomian style of architecture, its entire surface hand-carved in bold relief with intricate and fanciful designs. 30 feet above the courtyard and overlooking it was a broad balcony, and there, indeed, was Matai Shang, and with him were Thurid and Phaidor, Thuvia and Dejah Thoris, the last two heavily ironed. A handful of Thern warriors stood just beyond the little party. As I entered the enclosure, the eyes of those in the balcony were full upon me. An ugly smile distorted the cruel lips of Matai Shang. Thurid hurled a taunt at me and placed a familiar hand upon the shoulder of my princess. Like a tigress she turned upon him, striking the beast a heavy blow with the manacles upon her wrist. He would have struck back had not Matai Shang interfered, and then I saw that the two men were not over-friendly. For the manner of the Thern was arrogant and domineering, as he made it plain to the firstborn that the Princess of Helium was the personal property of the father of Therns, and Thurid's bearing toward the ancient Hecador savored not at all of liking or respect. When the altercation in the balcony had subsided, Matai Shang turned again to me. "Earthman," he cried, "you have earned a more ignoble death than now lies within our weakened power to inflict upon you. But that the death you die tonight may be doubly bitter, Know you that when you have passed, your widow becomes the wife of Matai Shang, Hecador of the holy therns, for a Martian year. At the end of that time, as you know, she shall be discarded, as is the law among us, but not, as is usual, to lead a quiet and honored life as high priestess of some hallowed shrine. Instead, Dejah Thoris, princess of Helium, shall become the plaything of my lieutenants, perhaps of thy most hated enemy, Thurid the Black Dator. As he ceased speaking, he awaited in silence, evidently for some outbreak of rage upon my part, something that would have added to the spice of his revenge. But I did not give him the satisfaction that he craved. Instead, I did the one thing of all others that might rouse his anger and increase his hatred of me, for I knew that if I died, Dejah Thoris too would find a way to die before they could heap further tortures or indignities upon her. Of all the Holy of Holies, which the Thurn venerates and worships, none is more revered than the yellow wig which covers his bald pate, and next thereto comes the circlet of gold and the great diadem, whose scintillant rays mark the attainment of the 10th cycle. And knowing this, I removed the wig and circlet from my head, tossing them carelessly upon the flagging of the court. Then I wiped my feet upon the yellow tresses, and as a groan of rage arose from the balcony, I spat full upon the holy diadem. Matai Shang went livid with anger, but upon the lips of Thurid I could see a grim smile of amusement, for to him these things were not holy. So, lest he should derive too much amusement from my act, I cried, and thus did I with the holies of Isis, goddess of life eternal, ere I threw Isis herself to the mob that once had worshipped her, to be torn to pieces in her own temple. That put an end to Thurid's grinning, for he had been high in the favor of Isis. "Let us have an end to this blaspheming," he cried, turning to the father of Therns. Matai Shang rose, and leaning over the edge of the balcony, gave voice to the weird call that I had heard from the lips of the priests upon the tiny balcony upon the face of the golden cliffs overlooking the valley door, when, in times past, they called the fearsome white apes and the hideous plant men to the feasts of the victims floating down the broad bosom of the mysterious Ish toward the Cillian-infested waters of the lost sea of Chorus. "Let loose the death!" he cried, and immediately a dozen doors in the base of the tower swung open, and a dozen grim and terrible banths sprang into the arena. This was not the first time that I had faced the ferocious Barsoomian lion, but never had I been pitted single-handed against a full dozen of them. Even with the assistance of the fierce Woola, there could be but a single outcome to so unequal a struggle. For a moment the beasts hesitated beneath the brilliant glare of the torches, but presently their eyes, becoming accustomed to the light, fell upon Woola and me, and with bristling manes and deep-throated roars they advanced, lashing their tawny sides with their powerful tails. In the brief interval of life that was left me, I shot a last parting glance toward my Dejah Thoris. Her beautiful face was set in an expression of horror, and as my eyes met hers she extended both arms toward me, as, struggling with the guards who now held her, she endeavored to cast herself from the balcony into the pit beneath, that she might share my death with me. Then, as the banths were about to close upon me, she turned and buried her dear face in her arms. Suddenly my attention was drawn toward Thuvia Parth. The beautiful girl was leaning far over the edge of the balcony, her eyes bright with excitement. In another instant the banths would be upon me, but I could not force my gaze from the features of the red girl, for I knew that her expression meant anything but the enjoyment of the grim tragedy that would so soon be enacted below her. There was some deeper, hidden meaning which I sought to solve. For an instant I thought of relying on my earthly muscles and agility to escape the banths and reach the balcony, which I could easily have done, but I could not bring myself to desert the faithful Woola and leave him to die alone beneath the cruel fangs of the hungry banths. That is not the way upon Barsoom, nor was it ever the way of John Carter. Then the secret of Thuvia's excitement became apparent as from her lips there issued the purring sound I had heard once before. That time that, within the golden cliffs, she called the fierce banths about her, and led them as a shepherdess might lead her flock of meek and harmless sheep. At the first note of that soothing sound the banths halted in their tracks, and every fierce head went high as the beast sought the origin of the familiar call. Presently they discovered the red girl on the balcony above them, and turning, roared out their recognition and their greeting. Guards sprang to drag Thuvia away, But ere they had succeeded, she had hurled a volley of commands at the listening brutes, and as one they turned and marched back into their dens.
"You need not fear them now, John Carter,"
cried Thuvia before they could silence her.
"Those bants will never harm you now, nor Woola either."
It was all I cared to know. There was naught to keep me from that balcony now, and with a long running leap I sprang far aloft until my hands grasped its lower sill. In an instant all was wild confusion. Matai Shang shrank back. Thurid sprang forward with drawn sword to cut me down. Again Dejah Thoris wielded her heavy irons and fought him back. Then Matai Shang grasped her about the waist and dragged her away through a door leading within the tower. For an instant Thurid hesitated, and then, as though fearing that the father of Therns would escape him with the Princess of Helium, he too dashed from the balcony in their wake. Phaidor alone retained her presence of mind. 2 of the guards she ordered to bear away Thuvia of Parth. The others she commanded to remain and prevent me from following. Then she turned toward me.
"John Carter," she cried, "for the last time I offer you the love of Phaidor, daughter of the holy Hecador. Accept, and your princess shall be returned to the court of her grandfather, and you shall live in peace and happiness. Refuse, and the fate that my father has threatened shall fall upon Dejah Thoris. You cannot save her now, for by this time they have reached a place where even you may not follow. Refuse, and naught can save you. For though the way to the last stronghold of the holy therns was made easy for you, the way hence hath been made impossible. What say you?"
"You knew my answer, Phaidor," I replied, "before ever you spoke." "Make way," I cried to the guards, "for John Carter, Prince of Helium, would pass." With that I leaped over the low baluster that surrounded the balcony, and with drawn longsword faced my enemies. There were 3 of them, but Phaidor must have guessed what the outcome of the battle would be, for she turned and fled from the balcony the moment she saw that I would have none of her proposition. The 3 guardsmen did not wait for my attack. Instead they rushed me, the 3 of them simultaneously, and it was that which gave me an advantage, for they fouled one another in the narrow precincts of the balcony, so that the foremost of them stumbled full upon my blade at the first onslaught. The red stain upon my point roused to its full the odd bloodlust of the fighting man that has ever been so strong within my breast, so that my blade flew through the air with a swiftness and deadly accuracy that threw the 2 remaining therns into wild despair. When at last the sharp steel found the heart of one of them, the other turned to flee, and guessing that his steps would lead him along the way taken by those I sought, I let him keep ever far enough ahead to think that he was safely escaping my sword. Through several inner chambers he raced until he came to a spiral runway. Up this he dashed, I in close pursuit. At the upper end we came out into a small chamber, the walls of which were planked except for a single window overlooking the slopes of Orts and the valley of lost souls beyond. Here the fellow tore frantically at what appeared to be but a piece of the blank wall opposite the single window. In an instant I guessed that it was a secret exit from the room, and so I paused that he might have an opportunity to negotiate it, for I cared nothing to take the life of this poor servitor. All I craved was a clear road in pursuit of Dejah Thoris, my long-lost princess. But, try as he would, the panel would yield neither to cunning nor force, so that eventually he gave up and turned to face me. "Go thy way, Thurn," I said to him, pointing toward the entrance to the runway up which we had but just come. "I have no quarrel with you, nor do I crave your life. Go." For answer he sprang upon me with his sword, and so suddenly at that I was like to have gone down before his first rush. So there was nothing for it but to give him what he sought, and that as quickly as might be, that I might not be delayed too long in this chamber while Matai Shang and Thurid made way with Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Parth. The fellow was a clever swordsman, resourceful and extremely tricky. In fact, he seemed never to have heard that there existed such a thing as a code of honor, for he repeatedly outraged a dozen Barsoomian fighting customs that an honorable man would rather die than ignore. He even went so far as to snatch his holy wig from his head and throw it in my face, so as to blind me for a moment while he thrust at my unprotected breast. When he thrust, however, I was not there, for I had fought with therns before, and while none had ever resorted to precisely that same expedient, I knew them to be the least honorable and most treacherous fighters upon Mars, and so was ever on the alert for some new and devilish subterfuge when I was engaged with one of their race. But at length he overdid the thing.
for drawing his short sword, he hurled it, javelin-wise, at my body, at the same instant rushing upon me with his long sword. A single sweeping circle of my own blade caught the flying weapon and hurled it clattering against the far wall. And then, as I sidestepped my antagonist's impetuous rush, I let him have my point full in the stomach as he hurtled by. Clear to the hilt my weapon passed through his body, and with a frightful shriek he sank to the floor, dead. Halting only for the brief instant that was required to wrench my sword from the carcass of my late antagonist, I sprang across the chamber to the blank wall beyond, through which the thern had attempted to pass. Here I sought for the secret of its lock, but all to no avail. In despair I tried to force the thing, but the cold, unyielding stone might well have laughed at my futile, puny endeavors. In fact, I could have sworn that I caught the faint suggestion of taunting laughter from beyond the baffling panel. In disgust, I desisted from my useless efforts and stepped to the chamber's single window. The slopes of Orts and the distant valley of Lost Souls held nothing to compel my interest then, but towering far above me, the tower's carved wall riveted my keenest attention. Somewhere within that massive pile was Dejah Thoris. Above me I could see windows. There possibly lay the only way by which I could reach her. The risk was great, but not too great when the fate of the world's most wondrous woman was at stake. I glanced below. 100 feet beneath lay jagged granite boulders at the brink of a frightful chasm upon which the tower abutted, and if not upon the boulders, then at the chasm's bottom lay death, should a foot slip but once, or clutching fingers lose their hold for the fraction of an instant. But there was no other way, and with a shrug, which I must admit was half-shudder, I stepped to the window's outer sill and began my perilous ascent. To my dismay I found that, unlike the ornamentation upon most heliometic structures, the edges of the carvings were quite generally rounded, so that at best my every hold was most precarious. 50 feet above me commenced a series of projecting cylindrical stones some 6 inches in diameter. These apparently circled the tower at 6-foot intervals, in bands 6 feet apart, and as each stone cylinder protruded some 4 or 5 inches beyond the surface of the other ornamentation, they presented a comparatively easy mode of ascent could I but reach them. Laboriously I climbed toward them by way of some windows which lay below them, for I hoped that I might find ingress to the tower through one of these, and thence an easier avenue along which to prosecute my search. At times so slight was my hold upon the rounded surfaces of the carving's edges that a sneeze, a cough, or even a slight gust of wind would have dislodged me and sent me hurtling to the depths below. But finally I reached a point where my fingers could just clutch the sill of the lowest window, and I was on the point of breathing a sigh of relief when the sound of voices came to me from above through the open window. "He can never solve the secret of that lock." The voice was Matai Shang's. "Let us proceed to the hangar above, that we may be far to the south before he finds another way, should that be possible." "All things seem possible to that vile Kalat," replied another voice, which I recognized as Thurid's. "Then let us haste," said Matai Shang. "But to be doubly sure, I will leave 2 who shall patrol this runway. Later they may follow us upon another flyer, overtaking us at Kau." My upstretched fingers never reached the window's sill. At the first sound of the voices I drew back my hand and clung there to my perilous perch, flattened against the perpendicular wall, scarce daring to breathe. What a horrible position, indeed, in which to be discovered by Thurid! He had but to lean from the window to push me with his sword's point into eternity. Presently the sound of the voices became fainter, and once again I took up my hazardous ascent, now more difficult since more circuitous, for I must climb so as to avoid the windows. Matai Shang's reference to the hangar and the flyers indicated that my destination lay nothing short of the roof of the tower, and toward this seemingly distant goal I set my face. The most difficult and dangerous part of the journey was accomplished at last, and it was with relief that I felt my fingers close about the lowest of the stone cylinders. It is true that these projections were too far apart to make the balance of the ascent anything of a sinecure, but I at least had always within my reach a point of safety to which I might cling in case of accident. Some 10 feet below the roof, the wall inclined slightly inward, possibly a foot in the last 10 feet, and here the climbing was indeed immeasurably easier, so that my fingers soon clutched the eaves. As I drew my eyes above the level of the tower's top, I saw a flyer all but ready to rise. Upon her deck were Matai Shang, Phaidor, Dejah Thoris, Thuvia Parth, and a few Thern warriors, while near her was Thurid in the act of clambering aboard. He was not 10 paces from me, facing in the opposite direction, and what cruel freak of fate should have caused him to turn about just as my eyes topped the roof's edge, I may not even guess. But turn he did, and when his eyes met mine, his wicked face lighted with a malignant smile as he leaped toward me, where I was hastening to scramble to the secure footing of the roof. Dejah Thoris must have seen me at the same instant, for she screamed a useless warning just as Thurid's foot, swinging in a mighty kick, landed full in my face. Like a felled ox, I reeled and tumbled backward over the tower's side. End of chapter 4.